Is that better, brothers? Can you hear me? Oh, sorry for the caps. Okay, thank you. I'm unfortunately going to have to do that again. All right, well, starting from the top then. In today's world, it's important to remember when we discuss spiritual idleness, the parable of our Lord going out to search for workers for his vineyard. And when he approaches the last group, he asks them why they are standing around idle, and they say, "Sir, because no one has given us anything to do." And so he basically just says, well, just go and we'll see what happens. He doesn't promise them payment, but he tells them to go to his vineyard, and they do. We do not have many good examples today. Over 100 years ago, it would have been easy to find an example of a life that was not full of idleness if you went to a monastery or if you had grown up on a farm. What is put out in popular culture are the three examples of the businessman, the actor, and the athlete. These people, preserved from idleness, pursue their end, which is wealth and fame, through hard work, consistent effort, a lot of luck. But when we look at how the world presents it, it is oftentimes through frenzied activity, through great risks, and through many decisions that lack prudence. And when I speak of prudence, I speak of true prudence, not worldly prudence. And as a result, for as many of these businessmen, athletes, and actors, read any of their biographies or watch their interviews, they all more or less admit to these feelings of emptiness that follow their supposed successes. They have the same ennui as a teenager who's bored at home. So spiritual idleness, then, is the ability to move forward in our spiritual life or to maintain a spiritual bearing in ourselves in all things we do. Now, hard work, as the author points out, does not come naturally to anybody. No one is born a hard worker. They may be put into an environment where they need to work hard in order to survive. And certain families may impress upon and have an environment of hard work. But we should not be surprised if we ever feel the pull of the world, the pull down into idleness. Now, we must also take a quick look at the highest vocation, which is that of the strictly contemplative. That would be, for example, a hermit that retired from the world, managed his garden, and said prayers in complete secrecy, and more or less did not participate in exterior works, other than the tending to his own body and perhaps something that absolutely dropped in his lap. And the author points out that this is an exceedingly rare thing. And so we should not ever just jump or believe that we're called to this unless we are actually bound by weakness or age. And it is not really in alignment with our rule or our practices as knights. So we are not a strictly contemplative vocation, and the rules that govern judging a spiritual idleness would be different for a pure contemplative. Next, it's also important to realize that the world already views religious people as idle, even within the church. While there is a greater and more prevalent current in society praising the practice of meditation, although they don't mean it in the way that we do, they also don't understand worship unless they can scientize it. I've heard even Christians make these remarks. They talk about the studies that show that singing, for example, alleviates stress. And so that's how they can justify why religious people sing hymns in church. Our holy hours then get brought into some type of quieting of the spirit that they find in their daily stoic or whatever meditation thing that they're following. But to really invest in the spiritual life is to spend hours a day engaged in interior struggles that to the outsider does not appear to actually involve any movement of the body, or at least any that is consequent. So they don't see the value in it. While we would say that it was those religious activities that are higher than even the charitable works such as relieving the distress or feeding the hungry. Where they are also true, though, is that we can become easily idle because when we do these spiritual activities, we can quickly feel satisfied by them. When we know that something is good and we delight in it, we can become filled up by the goodness. This is why it's one of the Beatitudes to hear, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." The fullness of righteousness will not come until the next age, in heaven. And so in this life, we can be assured that if we ever find full satisfaction in spiritual exercises, that is not coming from God, because God, just like when the apostles witnessed him ascend to heaven, the angels then looked at them and said, "Why are you standing around idle looking up towards the sky?" So God will not have us stand around all day watching him from the sky. Rather, our spiritual activities move us to greater zeal in the exterior world. Now we have to go through what the 7 consequences of this idleness is if we do stand around like the apostles looking at Christ. Or, even worse, if we just lie in our beds and do nothing because of whatever reason. The first is dissipation. Dissipation quickly destroys long work. It is best to understand as putting things off beyond their proper time. This causes the consequence of doing work too fastly on our next task and with a natural eagerness, rather than a supernatural calmness. It can also take on the form of over-talking or prolonging personal visits with other people beyond what is necessary. Over-talking oftentimes is just a way that we deal with not wanting to go to a less pleasant task that awaits us next. It can also be caused by having too many vocal prayers or exterior devotions to keep up with. I know that seems like the opposite, but if one, for example, has a whole stack of devotional prayer books that they feel bound to say every night before they go to sleep, then instead of being able to say maybe one devotion to the Passion and being wrapped up in that, they feel anxious in their spirit to just get through their rote of vocal prayers. Now, you all have prayer rules, and it's very important that this goes to show you that we not add too many things to our prayer rules once they're established without getting a blessing from your director or your novice master, or both, depending on what they are. Because we want to not have a situation where one does so many things that are exterior that they begin to feel disgust or anxiety at going to their normal practices. It's one of the ways the devil actually gets in to start undermining what we're bound to do versus what we're inclined to do. Finally, it's quickly dispensing ourselves from our personal rules. This is distinct from our prayer rule. But if, for example, we have a resolution that we make, maybe it comes about through prayer, maybe we're fighting over eating. And as a personal rule, we don't take seconds of things that we like to eat, so we don't overeat. But we find ourselves all the time finding an excuse. Today is a feast day. Today I have company over. I'll hurt my wife's feelings if I don't make seconds of this harder dish. Quickly, we find that with the spirit of dissipation has set in us. Now, it's important to remember what this more or less is. It's like being in a pond and knowing that you have to swim to the other side, but instead you choose to just tread water. So dissipation itself can be exhausting. And as a result of this exhaustion, it bears certain consequences. Self-dissatisfaction with all devotional practices is one of them. When somebody attempts to correct us or help us, we become defensive. We have ill temper with the judgment of others. We become peevish after communion in particular. This was something that the author identified, and I can confirm that there does seem to be, and also living in a family, seeing sometimes even the children get after each other, being more sensitive after they leave Mass and rather, in the seventh heaven. Becoming more reserved with our director, not sharing openly our trouble. We begin effeminately performing our duties. In other words, we look for shortcuts, or we do things the easy way rather than the hard and formal way. Anybody who's worked in, I think, I know many of you have been in the military and know what that looks like. And if you work maybe in hard engineering, you also know what that looks like. There's lots of ways you can do things in a half-hearted way and get away with it unless somebody checks. And then finally, a distaste for penance. We should always have a taste for penance. Penance is the sign that we love God. The second of the developments of idleness is sadness and low spirits within ourselves. Now, the author, in his sharpness, points out that many people will share their sadness and like to present it to others as a great interior trial, when in reality, and I'm adding, basically he said in many more words, but it's a voluntary venial sin. Now, I do want to point out that St. John Damascene, this is not mentioned in the text, identifies 4 different types of sadnesses, and he gets quite thorough into what each sadness constitutes, if it's a sin or not a sin. And he's just saying, he's looking at it for more like, I think the best way to look at it is, this is the blues. This is feeling just downcast. This isn't, for example, the sinful sadness of somebody gets something and they're living this great life and I'm jealous of them. That's one form of Damascene sadness. And then there's also a sadness of, I've offended God and I need to amend my life. That's a salutary sadness. And even worse, and I will add this, and I think this is from Gay-Lagrange, he points out that these sadnesses can be mixed, so it's not even easy to necessarily put our finger on it. But more often than not, what happens is we become weary of well-doing and strict living. And so, the spirit of sadness is oftentimes the reality that we've abandoned discipline to root out venial sin. The Imitation of Christ talks about this in the struggle with the flesh, where he states that you make your resolution and then you fall, and then you're sad that you've fallen because you're not purely spiritual yet. It has certainly been my experience as well that there is an abiding sadness when, for example, one takes up a resolution to resist sin. They cast it away, have the sin, feel sad for having given into the sin, but then they don't even pick up the discipline again because they say perhaps it was too much to resist. Sometimes it's also just a means to seek out the praise of others. This is especially coming from oversharing the unsuccess at the apostolate, in the conversion of others, and so forth. And we're really looking for people to give us encouragement and love. He also points out that the low spirits can come from that blending I was speaking about earlier, where somebody actually is not really pursuing the spiritual life, but a program of self-improvement with a cross. A Christianized form of self-improvement. And God, seeing this trouble, blocks their success so that they might purify their intention. But the consequence is a feeling of sadness. Now, the author goes to great lengths to say that if we have a perpetual state of sadness, that we actually are in a worse state than somebody in mortal sin, even if we have the grace of God, because it gives the devil great power over us. That did rub me a little odd, and perhaps if I've read other things I could reconcile it, but it's not an idea that I'm familiar with. He may just be being a little over the top there. But I do agree with him that it does give the devil great power over us, because when a person is oppressed by sadness, they find it very, very hard to even just get through the day, let alone do extra good. It blunts the power of the sacraments. Its remedies to stir one up out of sadness are viewed as poisons. So remember the 5 remedies of sadness. St. Thomas's 5 remedies of sadness are lawful use of pleasure, spending nature, to go into nature, seeking out the comfort of friends, weeping, and meditation on great things. Those are listed from the least noble pleasure to the most noble meditation. And so these remedies are viewed as poison by the soul who loves sadness. He doesn't want to see people. He doesn't want to have nice things, have a nice thing that might make him happy. He doesn't want to think about things like how short man's life is and how the sadness will not last forever. Or the grief that maybe the enemy that's brought him to sadness is going to feel at the judgment. And how if this other person doesn't amend their life, they're going to go to hell forever. Or he just won't let themselves cry. It becomes unable to bear pain when one is oppressed by sadness. Love is stronger than death, and so men can endure wonderful pain for love. But when one is oppressed by sadness, they cannot. And finally, even worse, and this was the one that struck a chord with me, was that one becomes brothers with Cain and Judas, because their sadness, theirs was not a salutary sadness, it was this form of sadness. Cain, of course, begged God, and God did give him the grace. He said, now I'm going to be afraid all the days of my life, right? Because I've murdered my brother. And he said, I'll put a mark on you so no one murders you. But he didn't really regret murdering his brother. He was sad he did it because now he'll be afraid. But he didn't look at God and said, Lord, deliver me from my sin. That never came out of his mouth. And of course, Judas went and hanged himself. So if you are oppressed by sadness, other than, of course, taking those 5 ways of remedying sadness that I mentioned from St. Thomas. Do not let up on your strictness or frequent communion. He recommends picking little duties and doing them exactly to stir one up, because getting little things done really does make one feel better. There's another technique I particularly like is if you want to buy a stack of flashcards, you can write out 5-minute, 10-minute, 30-minute tasks. And if you ever feel like one of these languor things coming on and you say, I can't do anything, go to your 5-minute stack and pick out one task that's 5 minutes and do that just to kind of stir yourself up. And the act of making the cards is in and of itself like already the will is moving away from sadness. Increasing spiritual reading. He recommends carrying a book with you. I think you should always have one book in your car, no matter what, personally. And he also has prayers to the Blessed Virgin Mary in particular. And she has so many wonderful titles you can invoke. Hope of the Hopeless, Our Lady of Consolation. And then finally, he says, cling to obedience. Cling more to obedience. And that's harder because we don't live in common, but you can always think about what your director or what I told you to do. And when the spiritual sadness comes, you could even say something to the effect of, I'm not allowed to be sad, right? And I've been told that I need to go and clean my counters, right, when I'm sad or what have you, and cling to that obedience. And there's a typo when you turn the page. Looks like I copied and pasted and didn't delete a line. So no, when one tries to remedy sadness, they do not become more like Cain or Judas. So that's from up above. The third consequence of idleness is a general languor. This is the state of continually making resolutions but not being able to keep any of them. This is also accompanied by actual physical weakness. Like your body won't even move. Its appearance is distracted. The main thing you can know if you're suffering this is distracted or slovenly prayer. You're distracted or slovenly prayer. He goes so far as to say that you're like in a trance. You're at Mass, you're saying your office, but you're not really there at all. And slovenly. So this is the difference between saying your office kneeling on your pew and like hunched over your pew, sort of kneeling, collapsing, or you say your office at night, sitting one way where you sit up and then another way where you're like lying back in bed, barely saying it. And I'm not talking about the times where, you're physically exhausted from, I know at least one of you pulls super like 24-hour shifts. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that's just how you pray now. It's and as from one of our previous classes last year, of course, you remember that to say your office in such a way is insulting to God, and it is probably a venial sin to say your office in a ultra slovenly posture. It's something definitely that the spiritual writers just hate. However, one of the ways this is not easy to conquer, but it's easy to fight. It's easy to put up a fight. Making a devout sign of the cross when one feels this, like just putting all into making one good sign of the cross, or hit your chest 3 times softly, like you're saying the mea culpas. You can also do prostrations. Now, this is a Eastern Christian thing that we used to do in the West. It's quite easy. You go down on one knee, you put the fist down on the other side, you lie down flat on the ground, and then you stand up and you do it as many times as you need to. You'll see old pictures of nuns in their rooms holding out their arms like a cross when they say their prayers. That's another way to get out of this languor is to force yourself to kneel and put your arms out in the shape of a cross. You can be quite inventive here, whatever works, but it involves the body. And it's important to remember that if your body's attacking you with feelings of weakness and you're not ill, fight it back, make it do things. Your body too is a temple of God. It's joined to your soul and your spirit. It too needs to worship God. The next consequence of spiritual idleness is useless industry. This is best understood as unmeritorious occupations that waste time. Now, industry, when you read it, makes you think about like hobbies where you do things with your hands, but he much more broadly includes reading, talking with your family, letter writing, and so forth. So really he means anything that involves the use of ourselves, but he views as a waste of time. So he especially warned against useless reading because it adds images and items to the mind that will hurt or distract us later. One of the things he says here, communicating excessively, and he just has letters, and he's talking about the problem of cheap postage. So I don't know what he would say today. We have email, social media, phone calls. What I recommend to do, and what I try to do, is I have set times a day where I go and I communicate. I check my email at certain times, and then I try not to check it, and then I have it set up in such a way that certain people, like my wife, for example, it'll always ding me, and other things go to the top of my mailbox list, like for nights. And then I deal with them one at a time, or I generally will look at them all a day, but I reply based on who came in first, or if it's an important issue and I'm the hold up on it. I'm the thing that's stopping it. And then I just don't do any more than that. Now, he calls the consequences of not doing this is unreality. He talks about all the various ways that by letter writing, we actually create a fantasy reality. We don't portray things as they really are to the people reading it. And when you think about this, for example, if I know somebody is sad, and I speak to them on the phone, I generally always try to present a more rosy picture of my life than it maybe necessarily is. And so in a way, I am creating an unreality that this person can try to be happy in. But we see the consequences of this when we look at social media and news, that there's a whole scientific study now of how to create unreality for people. And all they needed us to do to get into their unreality was to get us to go on and talk about ourselves on the internet or talk to other people. Now, I'm not trashing on this and telling everybody to turn off your social media. It's just something to be aware of, that a Facebook post that one labors 20 or 30 minutes to write maybe fall into that category of useless industry, and your consequence is going to be unreality. Now, he calls this the idolatry of family ties. This is quite true. It's not a problem that I've ever particularly had because I'm not tremendously close with extended family on either side of my families, but I know many of you have good and strong family connections. But it's important to remember that with our family ties, that they can try to drag us into things that are none of our business constantly. It is good for you to love your nephews and nieces or your cousins, to see them at certain times of the year, and to wish them well. The details of their lives, unless it directly impacts you, is unimportant. Even worse, the gossip, criticisms, and the manipulations that exist within families where one tries to use, especially a person revered as religious, to take sides in disputes. One should call to mind in the gospel that when two brothers had a dispute and they went to Christ saying, settle this matter of the inheritance, Christ looked at him and said, I won't. Basically, no, I won't. You should be worried about higher things. And that should be sort of your attitude as well. Unless it directly affects you, just stay out of it. And then finally, daydreaming. The worst thing about daydreaming is, for a religious person, is we imagine ourselves doing great deeds for God rather than doing the little deeds that we could do for God now. Now, he doesn't have remedies listed, but I have a remedy for, in particular, for the idolatry of family ties. It's really simple. Just don't say anything back, but assure people of your love. And in terms of daydreaming, I believe reading the books like The Light of the Lowly, the stories of the Desert Fathers, in other works, in other saints that have lives that maybe match your own. Light of the Lowly is a book of saints who weren't like St. Francis of Assisi. They were cobblers, they were day workers. The Life of Venerable Matt Talbot is another good life of a saint, but somebody who lived a normal life in an extraordinary way is a great way to remedy against daydreaming, because they, for example, in the stories of the Desert Fathers, there's a wonderful story about, I don't remember if it was St. Anthony or St. Mercurius the Great, it was one of them. An angel of God came to them and said, you please me very much, but know that there are two people in this world holier than you. And he said, well, I want to learn. Teach me. And so the Spirit led him into a town where he went to the house of two brothers who were married to a pair of twin sisters, and they had no children. And so when he knocked on the door and they opened it and they saw there was a monk, they were horrified when they saw that he was prostrate down before them asking for their blessing because they were holier than him. And this just terrified the women, just this embarrassed them and everything. So they got him inside and they sat him down and they showed him hospitality, and then he told them the story of the angel. And they said, we assure you, sir, there's nothing about our lives that is holy or extraordinary. And so he started asking them questions. He says, well, how often do you pray? And they say, we just say the prayer of the church in the morning and the evening, which would have been the Psalms. And we go to church on Sunday. Well, how often do you fast? We keep the fasts of the church and no more. And your marriages? We've never born children. Our marriage is quite normal. Well, surely there must be something. He goes, well, we've never told anyone about this. But we wanted to become nuns, my sister and I, but our husbands did not want us to. So we made a rule that we would never quarrel nor say a cruel thing to the other person. We would make sure every word we said was perfect and kind to one another. And he goes, and how many years have you kept this rule? For the entire length of our marriage, and they were very old. So they had exceeded other people in holiness just by the act of never exchanging nasty words with one another and by keeping watch over idle words. A truly extraordinary, and by the way, it did say that, and then the Father was astounded, and by this he understood that they were in fact holier than him. So that is an example of how we can conquer daydreaming, by those types of lessons really being burned into our mind, that humble and holy living is the best living. Okay. Not managing our recreation. We must have recreation. It has to be suited to our state in life, our point of advancement in the spiritual life, our natural character, and with whom we can keep good company. The recreations of a 21-year-old man who's unmarried are going to be different than the recreations of me who am married and have a bunch of children, and the recreations of a retired person whose children are all grown up. And that's fine. Our recreations are going to change based on how advanced we are in the spiritual life, and this is something that you do need to go to your director about or your novice master and to discuss it. I've had novices that played video games. Where they were at in the spiritual life, they pretty much, as long as they weren't sinful and they kept it under watch, that was an acceptable form of entertainment for them. However, to some other people who I know who are quite more far along, for them to say that to me now, I'd be a little surprised, and I'd encourage them to not go backwards. You will find, by the way, that as you grow in the spiritual life, things like that, entertainments, become empty, maybe even painful to you, and that they will no longer refresh your spirit, and that is a good thing, and you can move on to better things. And then also our natural character. I mean, some people are readers, and they're going to be refreshed by that. Other people are more about sport, and they're going to be refreshed by that, and that's fine. And of course, we should never do anything that's going to put us in bad company. So that pretty much eliminates any type of performing arts. Just so we're clear, like participating in almost all of that. Unless it's explicitly for church, like church choir or something of that effect. And and be careful out there with groups, because there's a lot of, it seems like even gardening and like medieval history and stuff like that, there's just lots of bad company there. The fruits of well-managed recreation is that it preserves all the graces we've obtained while maintaining fervor. If you take no recreation at all, you will get sick, you will get sad, you will get worn down, and the devil will beat you up. Every religious community takes recreation, even the strictest. The Carthusians take recreation. They don't talk. They don't do it together. They do it personally in their cell. The Benedictines at Clear Creek take recreation several times a week. They take exceptionally long walks where they're allowed to talk about this or that after they say the rosary together. The Dominicans take recreation every day. My understanding is that the seminary and the Ephesus Peace Seminary likes to watch TV for their recreation. I understand they particularly liked The Office. It strengthens our standing virtues and makes us desire for more virtues. That's the positive thing about taking recreation. It actually strengthens our existing virtues. And it makes us more cheerful. When you think about all the good things, especially when you do recreation with a friend, that's the third remedy for sadness. Or if you derive pleasure from certain reading, that's the first. And that reading might prompt us to think on deeper things, which would be the fifth. And I wanted to read here directly this line here from the work. It says, quote, "If our spirit asks us anything concerning food, sleep, clothing, and diversion, which is necessary to the maintenance of life or the preservation of health, or the right performance of our duties, or anything which obedience, fittingness, or right reason require, we must condescend to its requests and indulge ourselves in necessary recreations." So no one, I think a lot of people joined the order, including myself, when I did, and we viewed all recreation as the enemy. Through patience and kindness of the knights who formed me and directors, you have to come that, well, you need to keep it under control, but no, it is good for you. So here is a rule that my director gave me many years ago. Do as you can, not as you cannot. I think I said, typed that wrong. Do as you can, not as you can't, would be a better way. Bold in my error. All right. Well, anyway, don't do what you can't do. Do what you can do. The one story from, once again, back to the Fathers of the Desert. Remember, there were a bunch of monks playing a silly game. A hunter came by. He saw, I think it was St. Anthony the Great was watching them. He says, "What are you monks horse playing around for? Shouldn't you be praying?" I'm adapting the story to modern lingo. And St. Anthony looked at him and he says, "Oh, that's a nice bow you have there. Hey, can you pull that back for me?" He goes, "Oh, sure." Pulls it back. "Can you pull it back a little more?" So he pulls it back more. He says, "How about some more?" He says, "If I pull back any more, I'll snap my bow." And he says that if my monks don't get recreation, they too will snap. And then back to chapter 17 of the rule here, quote, "It is necessary to tolerate the elderly with pious sympathy depending on the frailty of their strength, and to honor them zealously. They shall in no way be deprived of what is required by their body, with the exception of what is prescribed by the rule." The reason why I picked that out, the chapter on sick and elderly brothers, is to point out that our rule itself determines our ability to do things based on the degree of bodily strength that each knight possesses. The more strength you have, the more we're going to ask. The less you do, the less we will. And a lot of this is based on open communication between each other because we're brothers. And we don't live together, but we can share enough so that we know if we're being asked to do something above or below, above our strength. But it's also important that young brothers be given the opportunity to do great things of strength too, like all-night vigils and so forth, so that they might have a way to show their love for God at the fullness of their bodily strength. The next is indifference towards the use of time. The loss of time is irreparable. Warren Buffett is 90 years old. He's a multi-billionaire and he's still wasting his time with stock exchanges. Pure madness. I would never made it to the billion stage. I would have given up long before that. But nothing shows you what madness the loss of time is more than a highlight like that. Losing time is deceitful because most people don't even realize they're doing it. This is why having a prayer rule is so important and going into direction regularly. It's a lot like going around your house every month looking for leaks in the windows, during the winter and what have you, so you don't lose that zeal through just loss of time. You're already winning once you begin to put things under discipline. A certain rhythm of our lives begin to emerge, and if we're able to stick to that routine as a rule of thumb, then we can make the adjustments to improve it constantly. The perfect use of time is almost impossible to become a habit. That's what the author says, and I trust him on it. So that means it's something that we have to be constantly attentive to. It should be a part of our examination of our conscience every day. There's a wonderful prayer to the Sacred Heart that at the end of the day it says, and all the time, all the good that I could have done and did not do is one of the invocations where you're asking for forgiveness. He praises the example of St. Alphonsus Liguori, who took a vow to never waste any time. And he didn't mention this, but I'm pretty sure his cause for canonization actually stopped when they found out that vow. And they had him do an extensive research to make sure that he had kept it. They concluded that he did. When you look at his volume of work that he did, it makes sense that he did keep his vow. And finally, one that you all knowing me quite well knows that I'm quite guilty of this. Being loquacious, our rule forbids, it says, do not love to speak much. All effusions of the heart, unless they're given to God, are undesirable. That's his maxim. It's a very common problem in pious people. My children get so excited and they want to talk to me about things, and they just keep talking even after they've made their point. And I think that's the thing about the spiritual life too. That's at least what my vanity will tolerate, I guess, sharing on that. But to the extent that is possible, to not be overly loquacious, especially when we're about our tasks and our work. We have to figure out a way to end conversations with people when the next task, or when we're interrupted from a task at work, for example. We have to try to mutually develop with others a certain expectation in a conversation so that charity is never offended. But that certain things we're just not going to talk about while we're at work, or after something is over, there's only a few things we might say, bidding them well. And then, to the extent that it's possible, figuring out a way to excuse ourselves. Now, here's a great technique that I use, and it's not insulting at all, but because we all live under discipline, and so we understand this. I have an appointment I have to go to, and it's true. If I answer emails, for example, every day between 6 o'clock and 6:30, that's an appointment. I have to keep it unless the matter is urgent and an emergency, because that means somebody who wrote to me is going to get neglected if I don't reply to emails. So if we do have our day lined out for us and somebody tries to draw us into too much of a conversation, we can say, I'd like to continue this conversation with you. Can we do it at another time? And you can even suggest the time. But remember that when we talk too much, we're actually injuring ourselves. And it's making it harder the next time we have to control our tongue, to not say a word in anger, or to say the praise of God at the right time. It's all the more harder to do. On that note, I will open it up to questions. Please go ahead and type it in. There is a delay of about 20 seconds. So there'll be a moment of silence if there are no questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
Talk about vocal prayers and exterior devotions, and sometimes disgust comes. I experience sometimes when I overdo it, too many devotions, this almost, something in me won't, it's like it's pushing it away. It's almost like repulsion. Is that what you're talking about, or?
Yes, that is basically, it's like it's a rubber band losing its snap. That's why, like when you look at the rule of Saint Benedict, or they punctuate the communal prayer with work in between it. That's in part to refresh the spirit. It's very useful once you've experienced that to kind of take note if this is just due to the day or if this is like a perpetual thing. If it's a perpetual thing, I would recommend pulling it back a bit. One of the things that happened to me that really years ago is somehow I wound up on everybody's novena email list. So people constantly were asking me to participate in this novena, and I looked at my director and I said, if I say one more vocal prayer, I think I'm going to snap, because I was already saying keeping my own prayer rule. And now I just put people's intentions in the office, which is more efficacious. Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending the class. Our next conference will be on prayer. It may take 2 classes. We'll just see. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. God bless you all, and I will be talking to you all soon.